My name's Dan Bendrups, and I'm from the Graduate Research School at La Trobe University, and it's my pleasure to be hosting the session this afternoon. And I'm coming to you from Jara country, the lands of the Jajawarong people, one of the places where La Trobe University is located. And indeed, we're located on many lands, and we also have guests today from lands across the sea. So I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my acknowledgement and respects to the traditional owners of these lands and to culture bearers and elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the reason that I'm hosting this event today is because I'm a member of a research cluster within the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, a cluster on wellbeing, critical and social perspectives. And it's an initiative that was generously supported this year by a grant from the research cluster framework within the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And because of that, we've been able to organise some events and bring them to you. So we're very grateful to the school for that support. This wellbeing cluster brings together social science and humanities researchers at La Trobe who all have an interest in thinking critically about the concept of wellbeing and analysing how it became a key focus of policy and public discourse, and exploring the effects of strategies to promote wellbeing, intended and otherwise. We come at it from various disciplinary perspectives and with diverse interests as well. And so there's tonight's event that I'll introduce very shortly, but then also next week there's another Thursday night event, also starting at 6 o'clock on the 5th of November, where we'll turn our attention to wellbeing in education. And on that occasion, we'll have two other guests joining us, Venka Simovska from Aarhus University in Denmark and Julie McLeod from the University of Melbourne. And if you're interested, you can find the registration details for that event on the La Trobe events webpage. But for tonight, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce two speakers who are talking to us about wellbeing in the time of COVID, and their presentation is titled "A Wellbeing Worthy of COVID Times: The Need for a Relational Approach." We're very pleased to be bringing this to you also as part of La Trobe University's Focus on Research month, all the way through October, where we've seen all sorts of really fantastic presentations about research and the various forms and sort of avenues for research that are pursued at La Trobe, within which health and wellbeing is an important and enduring theme. Our two presenters today are Sarah White and Shreya Jha. And Sarah is the director of Relational Wellbeing Collaborative, which is an enterprise dedicated to designing creative, self-sustaining solutions with organisations and communities. And with 30 years experience in social development research, she's published extensively on matters of gender participation, child rights, marriage, race, religion and masculinities. Formerly Professor of International Development and Wellbeing at the University of Bath in the UK, where she continues to stay on. Sarah founded the collaborative to advance regional wellbeing thinking and practice in interventions for social change. Shreya is the Associate Director at the Relational Wellbeing Collaborative, and she's an accomplished reflexive practitioner in social development and inclusive mental health, with advanced skills in qualitative social research and team building. Shreya's experience spans 20 years of programmatic interventions and research on disability, mental health and wellbeing, gender, children's lives, poverty and disaster reconstruction. And since 2009, she's been working with Sarah on developing a relational approach to wellbeing, which is indeed the focus of their presentation today. So we have a session that runs now through until about 7:15. I'll be handing over momentarily to Shreya and Sarah, who will jointly present to you for about 40 minutes, after which time we have the opportunity to answer some questions and engage in some Q&A with them as presenters. Now, you may have noticed that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is indeed a Q&A button, and that is the place that you can post your questions. So if you've got something you'd like to ask, please put it there and we'll do our best to to answer it either in conversation as we go along or with the presenters once they've finished their part of the presentation. Feel free to post your comments at any time. Yeah? As questions arise, put them into the Q&A and let that be part of the discussion. But without any further ado, I will turn over to Shreya and to Sarah and invite them to join us and commence their presentation. Sarah, Shreya, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm going to share my screen now so that you will all be able to see the PowerPoint. Is it okay? Good. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for making the time to be with us this evening. It's wonderful to be able to share right across the world in this way. Having had an emphasis on research, I have to say the presentation that we're going to make today is not directly talking about research, but is very much distilled from research. So if you're interested in the research that is the basis of what we're talking about this evening, we've given you a whole list of references at the end of the presentation for you to follow up further. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll start off by saying, well, how does the COVID-19 epidemic point to the need for a relational approach to well-being? And then we'll just talk very quickly about how the relational approach fits with other approaches. And then we'll go into, well, how do we understand well-being from a relational perspective? Then we'll look at what does this mean in practice in terms of design and evaluation of programs. And then finally, what does it mean, this relational bit? How does that fit in? And then how does it all fit together? So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our approach, but I hope that it'll make sense. And if it doesn't, then we've got the time with the questions and answers at the end to clarify. So I guess what is most obvious about COVID is how it has revealed our connectedness. So these incidental intimacies, things we never thought about before, how we are touch screens, hands on doors and gates, shopping trolleys, supermarket goods, how we're breathing common air, and this notion of aerosol transmission, which has become part of our kind of common language. And it's brought very, very much to our attention, I think, the materiality of touch and of physical connection in a world where increasingly we're operating virtually. So that's the sort of immediate, but there's also the global. So it's been astonishing, the global scale in terms of the spread of infection, but also, of course, the domino of response as government after government around the world began to shut its country down. Connections also then between society and economy. So this notion of working from home, as we've all been doing for a long time now. So first of all, it was about technology. Can we work from home? Will it work? Can we get the work done without actually going into the office? But increasingly, there's been an awareness of just how much of the economy depends on us getting out of our bedrooms and going into the office. So the whole kind of economic ecosystem that is sustained by commuting, which, as we know, as well-being people, is actually very bad for your well-being. Then school shut again. We started off being concerned about educational impact. And of course, that's strongly class-related, certainly in the UK. The kids who are going to private paid for schools are having much more online education than those who go to regular state schools. Then going on to worrying about children's well-being, and particularly psychological and emotional aspects of that. And then, of course, what we already suspected, that schools were not just about what they do for children, but very much what they do for the wider economy in terms of getting the kids out of the way so the rest of us can get into our paid labour. So all sorts of connectedness that is becoming evident. And it's connections not just then with society, with other people, but also with the rest of nature. So it seems anyway that the basis of the virus is the exploitative and careless transgressing of boundaries that we as humans undertake. So live food markets with all sorts of stressed creatures very close together, being killed very close to one another in Wuhan and elsewhere. And of course, these kinds of transgressions of boundaries are not just evident within COVID-19, but also other deadly zoonoses of HIV, AIDS, and Ebola. On the other hand, I think we've been very aware of nature as restorative, again, something that's well known within well-being circles, but nevertheless, within this time of being at home, people who are lucky enough to have gardens or access to parks or countryside have recognized, perhaps in a new way, just how important those are in terms of how we're feeling about the world and just appreciating what nature can give to us. And also, along with that, the capacity of nature for recovery and rejuvenation. So massively falling levels of air pollution, new awareness of birdsong, and a sense in a way that what we need to do is get out of the way as humans, stop messing things up, and nature will get on just fine. Then there's societal and personal dimensions of well-being. So society as a disease vector. So we're all very aware that although in the early stages, the talk of COVID-19 was the great leveler, of course, it's been nothing like that. It's been anything but. In fact, we've become more and more aware of how social inequalities and health inequalities are vitally intertwined. And this isn't something new, but it's something that has become, I think, newly conscious for many people. And of course, it's been reinforced by the Black Lives Matter, particularly since the death of George Floyd. So a new awareness of just how unequal our societies are and how that facilitates the spread of the virus. But also there's not only, of course, societal level responses, but also personal level. So there's a level at which things differ according to partly social factors, but also apparently individual factors to do with individual bodies, partly about comorbidities, other sorts of illness that people already had, but also some people just seem to be more able to resist the virus than others. Some people seem to be able to recover more quickly than others, have a sort of inbuilt resilience. We don't entirely understand what all of this is about. So there's that kind of physiological difference at the personal level, but also in terms of how we're all feeling and responding to the virus. So some of us are very, very fearful, people jumping back when you come, within even 3 meters of them, and others are fairly relaxed. So again, you can relate that partly to social factors, but there's also something about personality, personal history, that acts as a kind of mediator in terms of people's responses to the pandemic. So all of this fits very much with our understanding of what is driving well-being. What are the factors that promote well-being, as Dan already mentioned? And in our framework, we are looking at these 3 levels of it and 3 dimensions of the factors that undermine well-being or that promote well-being. So first of all, clearly, a lot of the well-being work that we're familiar with talks about the personal level. And that's important. There are clearly dynamics within the self, within personal history, within personal interactions that make a difference in terms of how people experience well-being. But that's only a small part of it. Underlying those, and of course, interwoven with them, are societal issues, societal social difference and inequalities, what the politics are, what the policies are, what the technological context is, cultural, historical, economic factors. So all of these are interwoven with that personal level. And of course, underlying all of that also is the relationship to the natural environment, to ecosystems, to climate and climate change. So unless we have this kind of very broad understanding of what underlies well-being and how these factors interrelate with one another, we really can't begin to get a grip on, well, what does well-being mean and what kinds of action might we need to take at what kinds of levels in order to promote it more effectively. So that's the first part of our kind of framework, is that the underlying structures and processes. And it's great to be able to talk to you as a group that is rooted in critical and social approaches to well-being, because that's very much where we've been coming from as well. Of course, this recognition of connectedness isn't new. So if you look at any mystical writings, there is that sense of the the essential interconnection of all things. And we're very much part of a broader movement, an intellectual movement also, which is increasingly looking at the relationality of things. So quantum mechanics, biological ecosystems, psychology, attachment theories and others, and relational sociology, of course. But I think with COVID, it has materialized that and given us a real consciousness of our connectedness in a different way. And of course, what it's also brought is it's brought well-being to the center. It was very much present within kind of national discourse anyway, but it's absolutely central now in terms of people's talk about well-being. But we would argue, not just any old well-being is good enough. What we need is a relational approach. So many of you will be very familiar with different approaches to well-being, but some of you may not be. So we thought we would just very quickly locate the relational approach within others. So very broadly, and this is very crude, there are two main approaches to well-being. The first emphasizes the personal and psychological and the individual level. So here, this is the kind of health and well-being approach. So well-being is seen as a responsibility of individuals, and the stress is on attitude and behavior change. This is the predominant approach in high-income countries. The strong emphasis on the psychosocial and the subjective, with programs, typical programs being meditation, mindfulness, yoga, diet and exercise. And evaluation is typically through quantitative, subjective measures. So people self-rating their levels of happiness. The second approach, which is more typical in a lower and middle income country context, you could or could not say that this is a well-being approach. It's very broadly a welfare approach, and then to make it well-being, there's some sort of inclusion also of subjective dimensions. So in this case, well-being or welfare is seen as the responsibility of governments and other agencies. And the emphasis is more on the objective. So how are people actually doing in terms of standards of living? And the programs reflect that. So health promotion, violence prevention, nutrition, employment promotion, and so on. And evaluation tends to be through quantitative, objective measures. So statistics like human development statistics, rates of school enrollment and retention, and so on. The relational approach to well-being, like all approaches to well-being, or at least as they ought to be, puts people at the center. So it looks at people and engages with people, not as objects of programs, but rather as subjects of their own lives. So what this means is that the intention is to look at things as far as possible from people's own point of view, as it were, from inside out rather than outside in. And again, common with all wellbeing approaches, there's an attempt to look at the whole of life rather than just to separate out one bit from the rest. So an integrated or holistic approach. Where the wellbeing approach comes into its own is in terms of bringing together the individual and the structural. So it acknowledges the importance of personal response, but recognizes that the situation is not of people's making. So action needs to be, yes, at the personal level, but also at the community and the government and the wider system level to see how the different economic and ecological and social systems are interrelating. And it sees well-being as essentially dynamic. So it emphasizes process rather than state, but recognizing that there can appear to be a state of well-being, but that is underlined by a continuous process. So just as our bodies are apparent, we can recognize one another from day to day, but at the same time, the cells of our bodies are constantly renewing themselves. We are actually in motion, even if we appear to be constant. So in that same sort of way, well-being is constantly being renewed. It's process rather than state, even though it appears state-like. And our approach is not a domain model. So we have tried to develop a domain model of well-being. We have developed, in fact, a domain model of well-being, but ultimately we were just unconvinced by it. So domain models of well-being divide the world up, divide lives up into different kind of pockets. And when you try to put those into practice, what you find is that they just don't work. You ask about something you think is about social connections, people answer it in terms of the economy. You ask about close relationships, they answer in terms of values they hold in life. So it doesn't work in terms of the way people think about their lives. And it also is very difficult to make it work in statistical terms. You tend to have to do all kinds of statistical acrobatics to make your domain models work. So we decided the problem is not our particular model of domains, but actually it's that it doesn't make sense as an approach to well-being. Rather than dividing things up, we need to understand the interrelations and the flow between different aspects of life. So that's the practical aspect, but also theoretically, when we're moving to a relational way of thinking about life, domains take us back. They take us back into the old ways of chopping things up, the old ways of abstracting from context, the old ways of thinking in silos rather than thinking in a connected way. So in both practical and theoretical terms, we've decided domains are out. We're not going there anymore. I'm going to hand over now to Shreya.
So if domains are out, what are we talking about when we're thinking about a relational approach to well-being? So as Sarah's already pointed out, and we can see that a relational approach looks beyond individual psychology. We're not interested merely in what individuals are doing, but it's looking at the underlying processes, what Sarah's already referred to, the personal, societal, and environmental processes that promote an enabling environment or a healthy environment, which then allow people to have, to enhance their well-being. And well-being then has interrelated dimensions, which might be the material, the relational, and the subjective. And again, emphasizing here that these are not domains, they're dimensions of well-being. And it does mean quite a significant shift to our ways of thinking, moving from, as it were, analog to digital, or from a very siloed way of thinking, chopping things up, to a relational, interconnected way of looking at things. So what then are the dimensions of well-being? We've talked about the material, relational, and subjective. The material refers to having enough. Fundamentally, this is really important for all of us. For those of us who are better off, we're less conscious of it, but in more marginalized, vulnerable communities, this is something that will keep coming up over and over again. Being connected, a relational dimension of well-being. And while relationality refers to having interconnections, having connections with people, it also refers to the terms of engagement. And it's really important in thinking about well-being and thinking about why it's important for well-being is to think about the terms on which individuals, groups engage with each other. And then, of course, there's the subjective aspect of well-being, which is about feeling okay within yourself. So we've talked about 3 dimensions, and we emphasize over and over, not domains, because they flow into and co-construct one another. There's a tendency to chop things up into distinct boxes, and this is something that we may tactically do in practice for purposes of assessment and measurement, but it's not, in terms of thinking about well-being, it's probably not very useful. And the dimensions can be assessed at both individual and collective levels, for instance, at a neighborhood or a city level. There are also, of course, examples of well-being being assessed at national levels. But thinking of well-being as a person-centered approach, that's probably something that we would want to resist, because at a national level, the person actually gets effaced from view. You no longer see the person. It's rather an abstract level to think about a national level of well-being. And thinking then, So we're thinking then more in terms of, in order to understand what this means in practice, we're going to take the example of looking at online education in India during the COVID lockdown. So what does education mean? It's a source of skills in India, where a vast majority of children attend government schools. It's also where welfare services are additionally delivered. So for instance, nutrition in the form of hot cooked midday meals for many children, some health services are delivered. And then it also has downstream effects, perhaps, such as staving off, say, early marriage for young girls. So it's very much seen as a route to a better life. This is, of course, constructed. This is very much construction of development discourse, and this is how people tend to view it. But in practice, does it really live up to all of these expectations? In practice, what we see is that education is actually very much constructed through existing inequity and inequalities that are there in communities and societies. So there's inequity of access, whether that's of economic class, community or ethnic identity, location, gender and age in combination. All of this also means that there is uneven infrastructure, with many government schools having uneven services, whether that's physical infrastructure, high student-teacher ratios, uneven access to learning materials, all of which results in sometimes quite subpar learning outcomes. And then if you think then about what this has meant in the current times, and thinking about children's well-being through online education, which is, like in many parts of the world, Indian schools have also moved on to. And then we think about children's well-being in material, relational, and subjective terms. So if you think about the material aspect of children's well-being, it has probably meant that children learn less because of the lack of access or unequal access to computers and to devices that can get them into online education. There's been children suffering hunger, compounding malnutrition through the loss of midday meals. In relational terms, it has heightened perhaps the experience of inequality, something that Sarah's already referred to earlier, how COVID has brought home inequality, and that's something probably similar that we see here in this context, where access to online education has heightened inequalities between households, whether that's determined by class or remoteness of area, but also within households, among siblings or among children within the same household, where access is determined by age, by gender, by disability or ability, with perhaps very scarce devices, but multiple claimants to those devices. For many children, of course, this has also further blurred the boundaries between schoolwork, studies, and household work. It's been a difficult boundary to maintain for many children anyway, and that's probably got further blurred during this time. And if you think about children's subjective well-being, they've been affected by loss of school-based friendships, leading to feelings of isolation, perhaps, and also where economic distress has led to many children having to move into labor and work, and the sense that education actually is not for all of them. So thinking about how we might assess well-being, or these examples of well-being that we've already given, we would look at two forms of data, the objective and the subjective. And when we say objective, in principle, that refers to forms of data that can be verified by an external observer. So for instance, income is something that can be externally verified. And subjective, where finally it is the individual who can give, who is the ultimate authority on that aspect of their lives. So while income is something externally verifiable, how satisfied an individual feels with that income is very much a subjective type of data. It's about attitudes, it's about perceptions, feelings, and what things or aspects of their lives mean to individuals. And this is quite important in thinking through, well, what is it that we want to assess and what's the level at which we're assessing, as we'll go on to understand. So when we're assessing well-being, we're thinking about these tiers of objective and subjective perspectives on well-being. So as you see, there are these 5 levels, 5 layers of assessment that we're looking at. And if I start from the outermost layer, which refers to the objective context, and this is therefore an objective type of data where we're trying to understand what is the general situation or prevailing in that context, or what is the general situation that a program, for instance, is aiming to change or understand. Then we have a subjective context, which is how is the individual or the respondent evaluating that general situation of a program. Then we come to the objective self, which is the respondent's own position or level of achievement within that context. Again, emphasizing here that even though it refers to the self or an individual, it is something that's externally verifiable. Then we come to the subjective self. How does the respondent feel with what they have achieved, with their level of achievement? And finally, the innermost layer that you see, personal well-being, which is how the respondent feels as a result of what they've achieved. And what we'll do next is look at some aspects of children's well-being in material, relational and subjective terms and see, well, what is it actually that we might want to measure? So if you think about the tiers of assessment and go back to one of the examples that we took of material dimensions of well-being, so children's learning outcomes would be one of the dimension, one of the types of material well-being that we look at. So are children's learning outcomes remaining comparable to previous years? So if you want to understand what the objective context is, what we want to know is from school records, for instance, that's an externally verifiable type of data, are children's learning outcomes actually comparable to previous years? And then the subjective context is how much you think school children are learning this year. And that would be put to an individual respondent, for instance. And the objective self would be, well, how much are you learning this year compared to previous years? And subjectively, how satisfied are you with how much you are learning this year compared to previous years? And finally, in terms of personal well-being, what we want to know is how does the amount that you are learning through school this year make you feel? And we probably rate that on a very unhappy to very happy scale. All of these would be rated on scales except for the first one. And then thinking in terms of a relational well-being outcome, we might think in terms of the effect on gender inequalities. And I'll go back to one of what I said earlier, that relational well-being isn't just about having connections with others, it's about the terms of engagement and what kinds of power dynamics exist in between and among individuals and groups. So if you think then about gender inequality, that's an aspect of relational well-being. So in objective contextual terms, what's the objective context we want to know about is, has the access to online education actually differed between girls and boys? In terms of the subjective context, we'd want to know from individual respondents, what do you think? How do you think that the access to online education has differed between girls and boys? And for the individual, has there been fair access to online education amongst girls and boys in your household? For the subjective self, how satisfied are you with your access to online education? And at the personal well-being level, what we want to know is, how does the distribution of access to online education in your household make you feel? And lastly, we come to subjective dimensions of well-being. And here we talk about school-based friendships and how they make the person feel. In terms of the objective context, we might want to know, how have school-based friendships been affected? And we might measure this by looking at, well, how often are children visiting each other? That could be a measure of an externally verifiable measure of how school-based friendships have been affected. In the subjective context, how do you think that school-based friendships have been affected? For the objective self, what we want to know is, for the person, how have your school-based friendships been affected? For the subjective self, what do you think about the way that your school-based friendships have been affected. And finally, at the personal well-being level, how does the state of your school-based friendships make you feel? I do want to add over here that we may or may not actually use each of these questions and levels of assessment for every single program in each of the dimensions. But the reason for talking about them is to be able to clarify what type of data that we're talking about and the level of assessment that we're talking about. It may be that some questions are not useful in a particular context, but it's useful to think through them for conceptual clarity, really. Yes, over to you, Sarah.
So we've got two parts of the framework before you. We've got the personal, societal, and environmental, and we've got the material, relational, subjective. But then underlying all of this is the relational approach. So as we're coming to the end, we just want to talk a little bit about, well, what does this mean to take a relational approach? And again, there are three levels that we've distinguished in this, and those are relational thinking, relational working, and relating to people as relational subjects. So relational thinking, again, we're, as I said earlier, we're part of a much broader movement. This is not specific to us, but it's about moving beyond silos and thinking about connections, flows, movement, the interbeing of things, how we're all co-constituted, how our relationships actually make us different. So it's about seeing people rather than as being individuals, as being related beings, and as beyond that, seeing contexts as the outcome of all sorts of interconnections. So complexity approaches, for example, take a similar approach, or systems approaches. So we're within that kind of thinking, relational thinking, thinking about the flow and the interconnections. And that means also thinking beyond disciplinary boundaries. So increasingly, we're recognizing that problems are complex, people's lives are complex. They don't actually fit these neat kind of academic divisions that we've made. And also differences between ministries, between transport and health and education, for example. We need to think in a more connected way and understand the interrelatedness of things. And it also relates to our understanding of well-being. So as I said earlier, well-being being not just a state, but actually an outcome, something that is an outcome of processes and a changing outcome, not something that is settled, but something that is emerging through the interrelations and the interrelatedness of apparently distinct factors. It also means working in a relational way. So it's a challenge not just to our kind of habits of thought, but also our habits of action. So what does it mean to work relationally? It means to look to work cooperatively with people who are the subjects of the change sought, and to think about the terms of engagement, as Shreya has emphasized about relational, the relational dimension, the terms of engagement with which we relate to people. Again, this is something that is very much already within the discourse. You think about participatory approaches and the importance of participation and the importance of collaboration. It's central to a well-being approach, a relational well-being approach, to do that consistently and to do that well. But it also means to look to foster collaboration with other agencies. So again, there's a bit of a tendency to to want to say, well, what has our intervention brought about? Where can we put our flag? Where can we put our logo? But relational working seeks to work in a rather different way, seeks to work collaboratively, seeks to enable broader partnerships and coalitions, seeks to look at what people have in common, what agencies have in common, rather than what divides us. It also means thinking in a connected way in terms of the local context. So rather than bringing everything in from outside, thinking about local capacity. How do we build up local capacity? How do we build up local resilience? So in ways that, as social and solidarity economies, for example, thinking about internal sourcing of materials and labour and evaluation and communication as well. And then it also means practicing well-being in terms of ethical standards. So not just talking about it in terms of something that is out there, but something that is very much related to our own modes of practice and engagement. So decent work, social inclusion, sustainable materials, avoidance of unnecessary waste, making sure that we're paying the tax that we should. And very much at the centre of that then, how we are treating people who are related to us as employees or collaborators or clients. And then finally, relational subjects. So we've already talked a little bit about having a person-centred approach to well-being. What is critical in a well-being approach is that we recognise people as subjects of their own lives. They're not just objects of our intervention. And usually our interventions are very small parts, actually, of their lives. So recognising that how important relatedness is to people, and that they are already in all kinds of relationships. And there will be positive aspects of those and there'll be negative aspects of those. There'll be some that are more exploitative and some that are more collaborative and empowering. But people are not separate individuals, and they're not even members of the groups that we like to group them into. So women or people of a particular ethnicity or children. They are interrelated with all kinds of different peoples and contexts that don't necessarily fit the way that we like to separate things out as different target groups. And those interrelations are critical in terms of actually how they act, how they see the opportunities that they have, how they respond, and the sort of decisions and choices that they make. So most obviously, if you ask me about my well-being, I will immediately think, well, how are my kids? It's very difficult to separate my sense of how my life is going from the sense of how their lives are going, and my needs from their needs. And this is very common amongst the people that we've been speaking to. They don't see themselves as separate individuals. They are fundamentally interrelated. That means they have responsibilities to others. It also means that they have claims that they can make on others, which are very important in economic terms, in terms of livelihoods, as well as in terms of the social and emotional aspects of relationships that we tend to think about more in a Western context. So then the glorious putting it all together. So at the center we have, how do we understand well-being? So those material, relational, and subjective dimensions. Then we have, well, what underlies well-being? What is it that promotes well-being? And then we have, again, the personal, the societal, and the environmental as what we like to call promoters or drivers of well-being, and the structures and processes that each of those involves. And then we have underlying all of that, then a broader commitment to a relational approach. And it's something that it's actually quite hard. We're very much schooled, and academically we're schooled in terms of being good at dividing up and analysing in separate ways. But being able to see the interrelatedness of things is actually quite difficult, and it's something that we're still very much, it's a work in progress for us as well. So the uses of a relational approach to well-being then. Hopefully it helps us to diagnose what is wrong. So to give a bigger picture beyond just the individual and how they're thinking and feeling, to look at the drivers of well-being at a societal level or at a community level. What is the environmental context? How is the environment and nature being affected, and what role is it playing in the promotion of well-being, and how is people's well-being affecting the environment? What are the societal aspects of it? So the economic, the political, the social, the technological, the cultural, that are affecting people's experience of well-being. And then what are the personal factors? What happens in terms of personal history, personal experience, personality type maybe, that makes a difference to people's experience of well-being? So we can think about this as a diagnosis of what's wrong, but also how we identify what kinds of action need to be taken, what needs to change. The relational approach also has an effect in terms of understanding well-being. So thinking about, well, what are the different dimensions of well-being outcomes, material, relational, and subjective? And then how can we sort of think about the different tiers of assessing those? Objective and subjective context, objective and subjective self, and personal well-being. And finally, thinking about our own processes. So relational thinking, relational working, and relational subjects. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward to hearing the questions that you have.
Sarah, Shreya, thank you very much for your presentation. So much to work through there, and thank you also for sharing those references and reference points with us as well. I might come back to you post-seminar and see if we can get a list of those to distribute to some of the participants. Questions been asked about that already, but we've got some great questions coming through, and some that I'll direct you to in just a minute. But before I do, I'll just say to those of you who are participating in this webinar, please put your questions forward. We may not get to all of them, but we'll answer as many as we can as we go along. I'll refer these to you in the order in which they've arrived to us, if that's okay. And the first question, which came up earlier on in your presentation, and one that's I sort of had in my own mind as well, is about domains. And you sort of I got a couple of points there in the presentation. You sort of referred to this being not about domains, and I think I chuckled at one point there too, because I think I understand what you mean by that. But as one of our participants points out, so maybe we could have a bit more of explanation about that. What does the term domain mean in this context of well-being? What do we understand that as, and why might we be at odds with it, and what sort of a domain-based approach might actually lead to? Can I ask you to sort of open up on that a little bit first?
So let me go back to this image. Okay, so the wheel of well-being is a... Oh, sorry.
Would you like to share that with us again, Sarah?
Yeah.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah. This is a domain-based approach. Yeah. So it separates out different domains of life. This is a kind of fairly open one, actually, that has many different aspects to it. Many of them would be more psychological. So another approach would be, for example, Riff's psychological domains of Riff's psychological approach to well-being, which has 6, I think, domains, which are all psychological domains, and which she sees as very important. So they would be connectedness, positive relations with others. Don't know, I can't think off the top of my head what they all are.
Autonomy would be one of them.
Autonomy,
yeah. Self-efficacy and autonomy, yeah.
That's right. So domains are a way of trying to, on the one hand, kind of get the breadth of sort of all different aspects of life, but also dividing them up. So if you're doing a domain approach in a kind of classical psychological way, you're actually going to test that these domains hang together, so that you've got, you might identify different aspects, for example, of positive relations to others. And then those different aspects should connect together in a way that identifies them as a domain. So basically, it's about correlations between different indicators. It should identify them as a domain, and it should identify them as a domain that is separate from other domains. So in terms of the statistics, the way that you get high kind of correlations between different variables is to ask very similar questions, so that they do kind of come together. If you ask different questions, so different aspects, for example, of relations with other people, positive relations with others, you'll tend to find that your correlations don't quite work in the way that you want them to. So there's a level sort of statistically in which you kind of need to fix it. And factor analysis actually is full of different sort of decisions that people make to discount data that is inconvenient to the model that they are seeking to develop. So that's one aspect of it, that we're just a bit unconvinced by the sort of statistical basis of these things. But much more importantly, what we found is you just can't, people don't think like this. So for example, if we asked a question about, how are close relationships within the family, people would respond by talking about their economic situation. So it just doesn't reflect the way that people themselves think about their lives. What's important is to get a sense of the interconnectedness rather than the divisions between different aspects of life. And what we came to think is it isn't that any particular domain model has kind of got it wrong and there's going to be one that will get it right, but rather that actually thinking about life in terms of separate domains, it just doesn't work. What we need to do is to look for the connectedness rather than look for divisions and separable aspects of life. Shreya, do you want to come in on that at all?
Yes, also just to add, so you've talked about it in terms of, the statistical side of it, but also just in terms of practical, how programs work. So programs also tend to focus on, obviously, on particular aspects of people's lives, but also tend to employ a domain-based approach without taking into account necessarily how much one aspect of people's lives is affected by other things going on in the environment. So for that reason too, it's important to think beyond domains, and we avoid thinking in that manner and trying to move beyond that.
Thank you very much for those responses. I'd like to convey a question from Miriam, who'd like to know a little bit more about the objective and subjective perspectives on all of this, which you brought up as well. And I'll convey Miriam's question to you. She says, can't these approaches, the objective and the subjective, in your understanding of relational, lead to ideological understandings of well-being? Can't our subjective concepts of well-being be quite unhealthy if we don't sort of realize it? So, for example, we all want to be good academics without fully acknowledging how this undermines our work-life balance, for example. How we change our research to serve industry needs or other sorts of external drivers. So, in other words, our sense of well-being is often can be or could be quite unhealthy, I guess. So how do you, is this something you've considered? How do you make sense of this? How do we reconcile these different internal, external, objective, subjective forces in our well-being lives?
I guess the first thing I'd say is we need to sort of separate out what is well-being and what isn't. So I think, having just recently come out of an academic career, I'm very aware of how many aspects of it undermine well-being. I don't think academic careers are about advancing well-being. They're about other things. So I think part of it is about being a bit careful about our language, whether, there's a danger that everything becomes well-being. So I think we would try to narrow it down a little bit. In terms of the way we've talked about subjective and objective in this presentation is rather about kind of forms of data rather than kind of real subjective and objective well-being. Certainly, we are very aware of ideologies of well-being. And this is part of the reason that we actually started working on relational well-being. So we're very aware of the way that most of the academic work on well-being comes from a very individualist perspective. And this relates to, in general, a very individualist culture, both academically and in broader culture, to do with late capitalism. And our working on a relational approach to well-being is an attempt to draw from the understandings of well-being, or what it means to live a good life, if you like, of people who are, obviously they're not outside global capitalism, but they're in much more marginalized context and different cultural context from that kind of Western individualism, high capitalism context. So yes, we're very aware of how ideological well-being can be and how it can be very much driven, both in terms of that individualistic understanding, but also in terms of, cutting off people from environment, cutting off the individual from the societal. So ideologies of well-being, and trying to deconstruct ideologies of well-being, and trying to understand how our methods even of analysing well-being are interrelated with the ideologies of well-being, has been a very strong part actually of our work and of the journey that we have come on. Shreya.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd like to add to that is also, this sort of dichotomy between objective and subjective. They're not necessarily dichotomous, and a lot of what might be objective forms of data, objective perspectives on well-being, actually do rely quite strongly on subjective views. So that's also something that needs to be clarified all the time. So coming back again to your point about what they're co-constructed through the types of, so the methods and the types of data that we're using. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. There's another question here, and the question is this. So in your work in measuring relational well-being, have you noticed socio-cultural differences, perhaps, in the way relational well-being manifests, or in the way that material, relational, and social dimensions interact? Is it different in India, for example, than in the UK? Or are there universals at play that we should be aware of? What have you noticed?
Shreya, do you want to go with that one?
Sure. So I'll first separate out relational and well-being, and I'll just talk about well-being for a minute first. When we started doing our research on well-being, we were very aware that most of the discourse and most of the perspectives on well-being tend to come from psychology especially, and a lot of the theory around it comes from Western contexts. And what we were interested in is, how does well-being look? How does it look different if you go to a different context? And most of our research, I think almost all of our research, is in non-Western, non-metropolitan contexts. And it's because of the context in which we did our research that we actually came to think about the interrelations between, material, relational, and subjective dimensions of well-being. And one of the reasons also that we in fact emphasize so much on the material aspect of well-being. And it is through thinking about the interrelations between these dimensions of well-being that we then began to think that actually it isn't just enough to think about these dimensions of well-being, but to think about, what are the underlying relationships that drive well-being? How do you think about well-being in this joined up way, so that you're not just thinking about one aspect of people's lives? Because as Sarah's already said, when we interviewed people, when we talk to people, people talk about all of their lives, in a joined up manner. That is the reality, that's the lived experience of people. And that's how we came to a relational approach to well-being. Sarah, would you like to add more to that?
I mean, I think clearly people think about well-being differently in different contexts. So if I can give you an example from Zambia, one of the people that we were talking to there talked about how his whole life had been affected by a kind of deal that had been done the generation before between his father and his uncles. So the generation before, there was a need for somebody to stay at home and look after the farm and look after the elderly parents. The other brothers, his uncles, had all got jobs. So they said to his father, you stay home. You don't need to get educated. We'll look after your kids in the future. We'll make sure they get educated. You stay home, look after the farm, look after the parents. And that's what happened. He then was supported by one of the uncles to be educated, which meant that he went and lived, for 10 years, many, many kilometers away from home, didn't go home at all, was looked after by that uncle in his home, but not looked after very well. So quite an abusive situation. And then he was left because his other siblings were not supported in the way that had been promised. He was left picking up the pieces, trying to support his younger siblings in school, trying to support his elderly parents, trying to support his own children. So that sense of, the interrelatedness across generations and the importance of that, the flow, in a way, of relatedness across generations, I think is evident in a context like rural Zambia in a way that it isn't. I mean, obviously we are affected here by our previous relationships, but the idea that a kind of deal could be done and then that you have to pick up on the deal, and of course some things go right about those kind of deals and some things go wrong. So that's a very different way of understanding well-being. And I think in general, in India also, there was sort of a sense of a cycle that you receive from your parents, you give to your children. Your children also, through prayers at the times of your death, and so sort of pass you on into the next life. So there's very different, culturally very different ways of understanding well-being, and that's why we talk in rather abstract ways, so the material, relational, and subjective, or environmental, personal, and societal. So it's deliberately kind of quite general, abstract terms, so that can be populated differently within different cultural contexts. So yes, I mean, it's a really important question. Culture is really important, and also, of course, economic context. It's not just about kind of culture in a sort of abstracted way. So what people understand to be a good life will be very different, and there may be, there's false consciousness within that, in a sense, as Shreya talked about in the education. People believe that education is going to lead to a better life. They're encouraged to believe that by governments, by development agencies, and so on. Will it lead to a better life? I think the jury's out on that. So there's all sorts of levels and complexities when you get into particular contexts. So what we're trying to do with this framework, which is quite abstract, but is sort of encouraging people to think, well, what within this particular context might we need to look at? So let's not forget about the environmental. It's very easily forgotten, but let's not forget about the environmental, because ultimately, as we know, if the planet goes to pot, we're all done for.
Sure.
So that's the kind of the way that we've tried to balance that, the sort of universal. The universal is really within these kind of different dimensions to think about, but the culture and the specific is very much within particular contexts.
Okay. Well, with the future in mind, we've got a future-focused question here, and it's about programs. And the question is, what types of programs and at what levels, i.e. small, community, state, national, etc., what types of programs do you see a relational approach to wellbeing working best within? And maybe you've got an example of something that you think is exemplary, or maybe even a program that doesn't exist yet, but that you'd like to see happen into the future.
I mean, I would like to see a relational approach to wellbeing at all of those levels. I think it would radically change our understanding of, national economies. And clearly there's a lot of work that has been done. It may not be, within an explicit relational wellbeing framework, but there's a lot of work that is being done in terms of which is saying we don't want to go back to the old normal before COVID, but we want to think about in a more actually wellbeing focused way what the national economy might look like. It's obviously easier to think about relational wellbeing at a smaller level, so at a kind of community or neighbourhood level. So an example that we would give is there's something called the Bromley by Bow Health Partnerships. It's in east of London. It's in a very poor, one of the poorest actually areas in the whole country in the UK, and it's a sort of community partnership which has an NHS health practice, a GP practice at its core, but it actually started by a group of people within the community starting up, thinking, well, what can we do to make our community better? So getting together, having a community centre, and then gradually has grown. So they invited the GP practice in, and it's a very relational understanding and also a very holistic understanding. So you've got on-site, you've got health, you've got support for elderly people, you've got childcare, you've got debt advice and counselling. So you've got an area for children to play. So it's that way of sort of thinking in the round and thinking the connection between different people's lives. Some people are volunteers, some people are paid workers, really emphasising the quality of relationships that community partnership sustains. Making a difference materially in terms of people's health and in people's, debt situation and so on, but also thinking about how are people relating to one another. So that seems to us is a really great example of a relational wellbeing project, but has nothing to do with us. We just have come across it. We didn't promote it in any way. We just are impressed by it.
Sure. And in the comments here, I see Megan offers the Family Wellbeing Program from the Luicha Institute here in Melbourne, in fact, as an example of a model of a program designed by and for Indigenous communities, which you may or may not be familiar with. But if you're not, because I know you're in another part of the world, but there are others involved in this cluster who are sort of familiar with those programs, and we can share that information with you as well. I'm sure you'd be pleased to hear about it. So thank you, Megan, for offering that one up as well. There's a question here from Dana, which is that one of the challenges to a relational approach to wellbeing in research is measuring these complex relationships. It's messy work. How can we work with these concepts in scientific frameworks that demand accurate, specific measurements of constructs and outcomes? How do we do it?
Shreya, do you want to go with that?
Sure. I think my first response to that would be to say it's a work in progress. We have developed, as Sarah's already said, we've developed in the past a domain-based approach, which we're not convinced by. We are presently working on developing, ways of assessing these complex relationships in our work with philanthropy. And so part of that is to think through, well, what are the levels of relationships that we want to measure? So, are they, what kind of processes are we looking to measure, and having sort of that conceptual clarity of, are they relationships of, an intervention working with people? Is it relationships among groups of people that we want to measure? And as Sarah said, we have this abstract framework, but these specific indicators that we might want to measure will depend on the context where, say, an intervention or a program is underway, and what populates those specific indicators will come from that context. As I said, it's a work in progress. Sarah, do you want to add to that?
think it is really tricky. It's really very tricky because measurement fixes things. So if you think of, for example, social network analysis, and there are, as you know, very kind of really fancy computerized ways of doing this now. But what it does is it kind of monetizes, if you like, relationships or links, and it fixes them. So I think it's something that it needs to be kind of held lightly. We clearly do need to measure, and it's really important that we measure. And these kinds of subjective, 5-point answer scales are ways that you can measure things. So you can measure people's sense of relatedness, and you can, some of the examples that we gave there, you can, in theory, you can measure relational factors, such as how often people get together, how many people get together, and the extent to which people can, feel that they've extended their links, for example. They know more people than they did before the intervention started. There are ways in which you can measure these things, but they all kind of fix. So it's a bit like, I think, it's like with quantum mechanics. You can either think about waves or you can think about particles, and both are valid, but they don't both work at the same time. And I think that's the real challenge with quantifying a relational approach. We want to acknowledge that flow, but in order to measure, we have to fix. So it's about kind of holding that tension in a creative way. And as Shreya said, we're working on it. We're aware of lots of people who are much cleverer with numbers and with quantitative approaches than we are, that we can learn from. But it is about, yes, recognizing it as I think that the waves and the particles and the fact that, as with quantum mechanics, again, our instruments are a part of what is being measured. So the instruments that we choose will affect the measurements that we make. And that's something that we've become very, very aware of as we've done more work in wellbeing. We're actually surprised in our research on wellbeing how much of it involved thinking about methods. It wasn't what we expected when we started. But the way that the methods that you assess wellbeing are implicated in the accounts of wellbeing that you produce is something that surprised us, actually, but is a very important part of our learning.
Just to add one more thing to that, from the methods, it's also important to question what we mean by scientific measurement. So, do we mean by that only numbers? And I think Sarah and I would certainly make a push for also including a lot of qualitative data, which could also be scientific measurements. So I think it's also really important to question what we think of as scientific and what is rigorous. And as Sarah said, methods are very much implicated in how we understand well-being.
Thank you, Shreya. And I think with that comment resonating there, I think we've reached the end of our time. There's still a few more questions and affirmations there that I'm sure you can see from on the inside of this panel. But we've reached the end of our available time today. So can I, sort of on behalf of everyone who's here, can I thank you very much for your insight and for your presentation and for sharing your work with us. There's much that I think we've all taken away from this, and I'm sure there are many in this audience who look forward to engaging further with your work into the future. So thank you very much to you as speakers. Thank you to the cluster members who have helped us to make this event possible, and especially to Katie Wright and Tim Andrews, who've played a key role in organising things. Thanks also to Amy Cook and the whole La Trobe events team who've helped us to put the event on and make this possible. As with all things, it's a real group effort that enables us to be able to share in this community together in this way. So with that in mind, if you'd like to join us again next Thursday for the next of these seminars, please come back again. Until that time, Sarah, Shreya, thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you today, and best wishes going forward, and best wishes to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.